Thank you all very much for attending the talk I gave today at Oxford Department of Psychiatry, and apologies for my optimism bias by having too much data to present, so I didn't get a chance to answer questions. As promised, I've taken the questions from the chat and I'm just recording a short answer to each of them as we go through. First of all, thanks generally for the positive comments in the chat that people liked the approach. There were a number of requests to share the content or the materials. Because there's a lot of unpublished data, we're not going to make the recording of the talk more widely available than the within-house psychiatry network. However, if people would like more information about ADEPT generally, feel free to email me at b.d.dunn@exeter.ac.uk and I can send on information that is in a form to share. Probably most helpful if you're working with other disorders and conditions is some review chapters I've written about how to target positive affect deficits a bit more transdiagnostically, and some of those chapters I can share. Leonora Brown asked, why do we think that there was an association between increased rates of dampening and anhedonia in cross-sectional survey studies, but not longitudinal survey studies? And I guess my answer to that is we need to be very clear in our mind over which timeline we think particular mechanisms might act. Is it that the general tendency to engage in dampening appraisals is a steady trait that then would predict a long term into the future? Or should we see it more as a state phenomenon that at the moment I'm engaging in dampening appraisals, in the minutes and hours afterwards, my positive affect will reduce, but I wouldn't expect that to predict my positive affect weeks and months afterwards. So my current thinking is a lot of the mechanisms we try and target in ADEPT are a kind of hybrid trait state phenomenon. So that means we have a general disposition to use these mechanisms, but only when they're actually in play at a specific moment will they impact directly on affective experience, and that we might need tighter timelines in our longitudinal studies to pick that up. I'm increasingly interested in what we can do with ecological momentary assessment methods in that regard. Christina Surawai asked, were there any differences between people on antidepressant meds and those not? Well, so the first thing to say is we stratified by medication. So we have that data that was balanced between CBT and ADEPT. However, you need to be really skeptical of subgroup analyses and clinical trials generally, especially small pilot trials like this. So we have done an informal moderation analysis, and antidepressant medication status didn't differentially predict response to ADEPT versus CBT, but we were massively underpowered to run that analysis. I would make a few observations though about folks who were generally on meds versus not on meds, irrespective of which treatment arm they were in, did show a few subtly different patterns of response. I was wondering if what was motivating that question was a comment I sometimes get that is it true that antidepressant meds are unhelpful with regards to anhedonia? So whilst they might bring down negative mood, do they also blunt positive feelings? My current take on the literature, largely based on the secondary analysis we did in the CPT2 trial, is that medications are effective at bringing down anhedonia. They just don't fully. So clients at the end of a treatment might say, I'm still feeling a lack of positivity, and I wonder if that's because I'm taking these drugs. I would say that's because the drugs are partially successful, not that they've actually driven that as a side effect. Cam asked a question about whether this work might translate transdiagnostically, for example, use of alcohol, substances, or other maladaptive coping. So this will be a speculative answer because we don't have the data to answer that. What I would say is we're increasingly realizing there are reward deficits or impairments in a whole range of transdiagnostic presentations, including substance abuse, eating disorders, trauma, as well as depression. I think it's useful to draw a distinction between disorders of under reward activity versus over reward activity, and depression's very much at the under reward activity. So I think the stuff we've done in ADEPT speaks more to other disorders that have stable deficits in anhedonia, for example, maybe restrictive eating disorders, or the numbing you see in PTSD. I think it might need some subtle tweaks for clients who have an overactive reward system, like in bipolar disorder, or potentially some adaptations where people have a mixture, where they might be reward insensitive and then chase rewards to get a high, which might be the case in substance abuse. So I think this general line of work has promise in those areas, but we've got no data to speak to it yet. What I would say is the minute you start making well-being your primary outcome, and you see whatever symptoms or diagnostic label people have got as the barrier to achieving that well-being, the ADEPT framework becomes a potentially radically transdiagnostic approach, where you basically say, how is your eating disorder or how is your substance abuse getting in the way of you being resilient and thriving at the moment? And how can we give you new patterns of thinking and behaving that might better meet your needs? So I do think it has potential in those areas, but it requires proper evaluation and some thoughtful adaptation about whether the particular patterns of coping and thinking that clients with different disorders use are different as a function of the primary disorder. Ash Singh asked, are there any plans to compare the efficacy of ADEPT to psychoanalytic treatment? The short answer to that is no, not at the moment. Having just run a pilot trial that took me 5 years and being about to try and get funding for a definitive trial that will probably take me another 5 years, I'm realizing quite how much hard work goes into trials. I don't think the way forward for our field is a series of head-to-head comparisons between every different combination of treatments. What I think we should do is, when we're introducing a new therapy, take the best current standard and use that as your comparator, and then use things like network meta-analyses to allow to cross-reference to other treatments that we know quite a lot about already. Ruth Bear says it would be good to talk about implications for threshold presentations and general population wellbeing. Yes, absolutely love to follow up with you, Ruth, around that. Couldn't agree more, particularly with the way that we might be able to adapt mindfulness to help build this positive affect for those groups. So I think that was all the questions that were sent to me by chat. If anyone has any more questions, do feel free to email me. It's a real gift to get feedback on talks. So when you're at my stage of developing an approach, I particularly value any tricky questions or comments on the way I'm trying to extract signal from a pilot trial from trial methodologists to see if they agree that I've taken a suitably sensible approach to doing that. Thank you again for listening, and I'm going to stop the recording now.